Can she ride with us, Lord, is what she's asking. Finan looked between Osrith and Utad, as she clung onto her horse, her knees to its flanks and his rein clasped between her fingers as the horse trod carefully through the open Mercen country. They had been followed, there was no doubt about that, and were about to cross into the part of Mercia that was not Ethliad's. It was, in name, Mercia, but Danes lived there, and as such was the Dane law. No outlaw here was Utad of Bibbenberg, for he was no longer in Wessex. And Osrith was free, too, for she had done what she had agreed with Alfred, guard the Etheling until his wedding. Osrith had passed Oxford not far back, having passed Silchester, Dorchester, and Bicester, up through the old Roman towns, using the less used but more direct routes to catch up with her brother. Utad was now beyond Watling Street and going towards Leicester, over the metalled road, and north. It had not taken her long to catch up with her brother, but it wasn't until she had reached Abingdon that he had realized she was there. And, she had not turned. It had not even crossed Osrith's mind that she had done anything to warrant returning to that wretched place Winchester. At Oxford, there was a road northeast, which would have taken Osrith on to Aylesbury. But she had resisted it, and continued towards them. The land changed. No burh stood here, no fortified Saxon towns. But life continued, settlements on which the Danes depended, into which they had begun to integrate themselves were dotted here and there. And they were at a place called Thoresby when Utad finally stopped his horse to speak to her. But not before the blonde-haired woman, Skade, had spoken first. Utad had pulled up his dark horse at a ford and turned, but it had been the seer who had addressed her first. "Who is he?" Osrith pulled her horse still as she spoke, her eyes, pale grey and penetrating, attempting to draw her in. But it was Danish magic, and Osrith was not in the least affected by her. "She is not a man." Utad spat, ostensibly addressing Skade, but to the effect of denigrating Osrith. She said nothing as Utad brought his horse around to her, and she noticed a pallor to his skin, a greyness, his eyes not really focusing on her. "What are you doing following us?" He frowned, widening his eyes to glare at Osrith. "Following you?" Osrith asked, feigning innocence. Utad wasn't well, and that was probably why Osrith had managed to gain on them. "Didn't I make it clear that she wasn't to come?" "No woman is to come, only her." Utad turned and was addressing Finan, while pointing back to Skade. Finan looked abashed. But Osrith drew her horse between them. "I am a warrior, not a woman," she declared. "Could have fooled me," replied Finan, softly. A ripple of laughter went through the men. Osrith ignored them, and continued her own stare back to Utad. "You do not own Fossway, Utad of Bibbenberg." "She's right," said Finan, laughing. "You don't own the Fossway." Osrith raised her reins and got her horse to step a few steps forward, then, when Utad had not followed her, continued to ride adjacent, far enough away for no one to think that she was with them as Utad's group continued. "Can she ride with us, Lord, is what she's asking." Osrith opened her mouth to say something, to deny this, but it was true. Riding with them did offer her safety. "She can do what she likes," Utad replied to Finan, loudly enough for Osrith to hear. "The Danes do not own the Fossway, either." That evening, as they crossed open countryside and were now in woodland, Osrith watched Finan, Sifric and Osferth make camp for them all, and watched still as Utad staggered, crumpling at the waist and vomited. He was ill, clearly ill, because of the Danish seer, no doubt, whose hands were firmly tied. Osferth had the misfortune of feeding her, and she had leapt at him to scare him, as the baby monk took off the rope around her wrists. For her part, Osrith flung up the cowhide she had managed to steal from the armory over a low branch and had bundled up her blanket around her, as she cooked bread and meat over a small fire, which would act as heat for the night. Every so often, she glanced over at her brother, who was now lying down under his own shelter. Utad did not look well at all, and was shaking as snow was beginning to tumble as secondary fall from the high treetops. Then, inevitably, she met Finan's eye, and he crossed over to her. Although she didn't make room for him, he sat by Osrith anyway, and she was glad of the instant warmth from his body beside hers. You will be cold, with such a small fire. Osrith knew it. And she also knew she had not put her heart into this plan of fleeing Winchester. It was hopeless to get to Alba. I have suffered worse. Finan turned to look at her, as she looked at him. And why should you suffer at all? Why come out deep into the country? You'll not make it to Alba across the kingdoms, and you know it. Osrith did know it. She had little money, or rather, she had plenty of money for a boat fare, to find someone to take her north, if she got to the east coast. But that meant she had nothing to give to Domhnall as retribution for, as it were, kidnapping herself from her, thwarting his plans of union with Cumbraland through Guthard. Uhtred, what sickness ails him? Osrith asked. Finan looked at her as if she were taking nonsense. He did not fly at me when I did not address him as Lord, Osrith explained. He looked as if he were preserving his strength. Finan moved as if he were going to stand up, as if her line of questioning was somehow an aberration to convention. But instead, he relented, and stayed put. That woman over there, the Dane, he replied, in Gaelish, she has caused him to be ill. She has bound his path. What does that mean? It means his life is forfeit because she has cursed him, Finan explained. I know. It's hard for us to understand. It was the first time that he had ever acknowledged that he had Osrith had a common heritage, but it would be a long time until Osrith remembered that night. Instead, it was the instant shock of the idea of a curse on Uhtred that shook her. No matter his behavior towards her, Osrith still found that she cared for his well-being, and she stared at the back of Skade's head, willing that they were in Alba or Irian where she could make a deal with the Morrigan, and break the curse. Instead, give a little of herself, her time, or obedience to a cause, in exchange, to the most powerful of all the Saich. She controls it, or rather, the fates do. But Osrith shook her head. I don't believe it, she continued, in Gaelish. That cannot be done, you know it. And Finan looked sadly across to Uhtred. He believes it. Then, Osrith realized, Finan had taken her hand. She was not inclined to shake him away from her, either. She wanted to say, to ask Finan to look after him, and that she would pray for Uhtred. But that would go too far. He may ask questions, or tell Uhtred who, if ever he should come across Bugger again, might discover the truth. Although there was little hope of Uhtred ever coming back to Winchester, after threatening a king at knife point. Can you help him? And she felt Finan holding her hand more firmly, and Osrith watched him look back to his lord. Not I. Something that will free his mind. But I will do all I can to get him to someone who can. They sat for a moment, hand in hand, as Sifik strode over to Uhtred, and Osrith was aware the Irishman's body was close to hers, his thigh by hers, his body next to hers. Yes, I will be cold, Osrith admitted, as she curled her hand around his, and she let him pull her into his shoulder. But I will find my way home again. If I go by ship, I will not have enough silver. You will not get past Eofic and Dunham alone, that is certain. He leaned his head towards Osrith, snow beginning to catch at the front of it. We are close to the Mercian capital. You fought for Mercia, once. Can you not go there a while? Earn some money, if that's what you need. And in truth, Osrith had been considering the same. They were beyond High Cross, and towards Leicester. South lay Aylesbury. She was about to say something when a flicker of movement made her move her head. Sifik was approaching. Someone that speaks that babble that you spout, Finan? English, Finan replied, and they laughed. Then Osrith watched as the man's face clouded, and his eyes flickered towards Uhtred. He's talking to himself, Sifik said, not quiet enough for Osrith to miss as Finan stood beside him. Get the baby monk there to feed him anything you can. We have to keep moving, Finan told him, and Sifik nodded. When he turned, he saw Osrith had got up and was stamping down her fire. Going home? Finan said, a smile flickering momentarily on his lips. Yes. And she had stowed her hide and was wearing her cloak. Will you go back? To Winchester? He stepped towards her and noticed a twinkle of silver in her hands. Do I have a reason to? Osrith asked. Finan gave her a reason, and then another, before a shout from Uted's camp got his attention. "We will be back in Winchester," he whispered by Osrith's ear, his breath warm and deliciously tempting. Osrith whispered back in Gaelish, "Finan more, I will try." And, watching him hurry to her brother's side, at that moment, she meant it.